The alarm had not even finished its first note when I noticed she was already standing. Everyone else in the lab was still frozen, half risen from their seats, eyes wide, breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a scream. But Mara Voss was on her feet before the sound even registered as a threat to the rest of us. That was the first time I truly understood what it meant to sit next to a girl from a death world. My name is Doran Kell, and until that day, I thought I understood danger. I grew up on Ostrin Minor, a quiet world with soft blue skies and gentle seasons, where the worst thing that ever happened to me was a mild storm that knocked out the lights for an hour. I had never seen anyone move the way Mara moved, not fast in the way athletes are fast. Fast in the way something ancient and hunted moves, like her body had made the decision before her mind had time to agree with it. She had transferred into our class 3 weeks earlier, and from the very first day, the whispers started. Everyone wanted to know about the girl from Earth, the planet the interstellar registry had marked with a single word that made even seasoned instructors lower their voices: Deathworld. I did not understand the weight of that word at first. To me, it sounded almost exaggerated, like something invented by nervous bureaucrats who had never left their home systems. But the more I watched her, the more I began to feel a small, cold seed of understanding growing in my chest. She never jumped at loud noises. When instructor Solon Marsh dropped a metal tray in the cafeteria on her second day, 3 students screamed, and 1 fainted. Mara did not even blink. She simply glanced toward the sound, calculated it was harmless, and went back to her food, which, by the way, she ate with a spice level that made 2 of my classmates cry actual tears just from the smell. She always sat facing the door. Always. In every class, every lecture hall, every dining area, she chose the seat that gave her a clear view of every exit and every person who walked through it. At first I thought it was a strange personal habit, maybe a cultural custom from her homeworld. It took me 2 weeks to realize it was not a custom. It was instinct. She was not choosing that seat. Some deep, old part of her was choosing it for her. She did not trust silence either. I noticed that during study periods, she would occasionally go still, her eyes flicking toward corners of the room, toward vents, toward shadows that the rest of us barely registered. When I finally asked her about it, she just shrugged and said something that stayed with me for a long time. She said silence usually means something changed, and change is usually not good news. I laughed the first time she said it, because it sounded almost like a joke. She did not laugh with me. She just looked at me with those calm, steady eyes, the kind of eyes that had clearly seen things my gentle little world could never prepare me for, and she said she was completely serious. By the end of the 3rd week, half the class had stopped teasing her about being the strange new girl, and started quietly avoiding sudden movements around her, as if some instinct in us recognized something in her that we could not name. The other half became obsessed with her in a different way. They wanted to know exactly what she was capable of. They wanted proof. That obsession did not stay confined to students for long. I remember the exact afternoon it reached the faculty. It was during a private discussion in Professor Ilya Draven's office, one that I only overheard because I had been sent to deliver a set of lab reports, and the door was not fully closed. Professor Draven ran the Xenobiology and Threat Classification Department, and she had a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession. I heard her speaking with Instructor Marsh in a low, clipped voice, the kind adults use when they think no one young is listening. She was saying that the registry data on humans was dangerously incomplete, that every report on Earth threat levels was built from second-hand accounts, damaged instruments, and old distress signals, never from careful, controlled observation. She said humans had a reputation across dozens of systems, a reputation for surviving things that should have ended them, for adapting faster than any known species, for turning ordinary tools into methods of protection with terrifying efficiency. But no one, she said, had actual clean data. No one had ever properly documented an unfiltered human threat response in a safe, monitored environment. Instructor Marsh asked what she was proposing. Professor Draven said one word, and it made my skin feel too tight for my body. Test. I did not understand fully what that meant at the time. I told myself it probably meant another written exam, another simulation on a screen, another harmless academic exercise. I wanted to believe that, because the alternative made something twist uncomfortably in my stomach. I was wrong to hope. 2 days later, a notice went up for our class, a special laboratory session, focused on emergency response training, mandatory attendance, no exceptions. It sounded ordinary enough. Emergency drills were common at the academy, required by law for students from dozens of different worlds who might one day work in dangerous environments across the galaxy. Nothing about the notice looked unusual. Except I noticed something the others did not. In the corner of the notice, in small print that most students would skim past without a second glance, there was a line about supplementary observational equipment being installed for the session. I had seen enough academy paperwork to know that phrase almost always meant cameras. Extra cameras, hidden cameras usually, dressed up in careful, boring language so no one would ask questions. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that even if there were extra cameras, it was probably standard safety procedure, nothing more. I wanted to believe that so badly that I almost convinced myself. But I kept thinking about the word Professor Draven had used, test, and I kept thinking about the way Mara Voss sat facing every door, watching every shadow, treating silence itself as a warning sign. Something told me that whatever the faculty had planned, it was not going to be an ordinary drill, and some quieter, more nervous part of me wondered if they had any idea what they were about to wake up. The night before the lab session, I could not stop thinking about it. I lay in my sleeping quarters staring at the ceiling, running the numbers over and over in my mind, the way Professor Draven had spoken, the strange line about observational equipment, the growing legend of the girl who sat 2 seats away from me in every class. I told myself I was overreacting. Academies ran safety drills constantly. This was probably nothing more than another checkbox on a very long list of mandatory exercises. But sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it was thin and restless, filled with half-formed images of doors that would not open, and lights that would not turn back on. When morning came, I walked to the lab wing early, hoping to catch a quiet moment before the rest of the class arrived. Instead, I found the corridor already busy with maintenance staff, carrying equipment cases into the lab, speaking in hushed, efficient tones. I slowed my pace and pretended to check something on my wrist display, watching from the corner of my eye as they carried in small dark devices and mounted them along the upper corners of the room, tucked behind ventilation grates and support beams, places most students would never think to look. My earlier suspicions solidified into certainty. This was not a normal drill. I found Mara sitting alone near the entrance of the lab, a few minutes later, her attention on a small data tablet, her expression unreadable. I hesitated before approaching her, unsure whether to say anything at all. Part of me worried that even mentioning my suspicions might sound paranoid, or worse, might somehow put me at risk if the faculty realized I had overheard something I was not supposed to hear. But another part of me, a part that had spent 3 weeks quietly admiring her steady calm, could not stay silent. I sat down near her and spoke in a low voice, telling her what I had overheard outside Professor Draven's office, describing the strange line in the notice, describing the equipment I had just seen carried into the lab. I expected her to react with alarm, maybe even fear. Instead, she simply listened, her expression calm and thoughtful, the way someone listens to a weather report rather than a warning of danger. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised me more than anything else she had said since arriving at the academy. She said she had already guessed something like this might happen. I asked her how she could possibly have known. She explained, in that same steady, unhurried voice, that people had been staring at her differently since she arrived. Not with simple curiosity, but with a kind of clinical interest, the way a scientist looks at an unfamiliar specimen. She said she had grown used to that look over the years, long before she ever left her homeworld. She said humans had learned to recognize it easily, because it usually came right before someone tried to study them in ways they had not agreed to. I asked her if she was frightened. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her eyes shifted, not into fear, but into a kind of tired patience, as if she had answered this exact question many times before, on many different worlds, to many different people who could not quite understand the answer. She said fear was not really the right word for what she felt. She said what she felt was closer to readiness. She explained that where she came from, danger rarely announced itself politely. It did not wait for you to prepare. It came suddenly, without warning, often when you least expected it, and the people who survived were the ones who stayed ready at all times, even when nothing seemed wrong. She said she had learned a long time ago that safety was never something you were given. It was something you built for yourself, moment by moment, decision by decision, and you never fully put it down, not even in places that were supposed to be safe. I did not know what to say to that. On my homeworld, safety was simply assumed, a quiet background fact of daily life, like gravity or sunlight. I had never once considered that somewhere out there, an entire species had grown up needing to build their own safety from nothing, over and over again, every single day. Before I could respond, the rest of the class began filing into the lab, chatting, laughing, completely unaware of what waited hidden behind the ceiling panels and support beams above them. I watched Mara rise from her seat, her expression settling back into its usual calm, unreadable mask, and I found myself wondering, with a small twist of unease, what exactly the faculty were about to unleash, and whether they had any real idea what they were about to learn. The lab itself looked ordinary enough once everyone settled into their seats. Long metal tables lined the room, each equipped with basic chemistry stations, safety monitors blinking green along the walls, and the familiar hum of ventilation systems overhead. Professor Draven stood at the front, her expression calm and professional, giving no hint of the discussion I had overheard days earlier. She explained that today's session would focus on emergency response procedures, a standard requirement for all students preparing for fieldwork across dangerous environments. She spoke about protocol, about staying calm under pressure, about following proper evacuation procedures. Her voice was smooth, practiced, completely convincing to anyone who had not overheard what I had overheard. I glanced toward Mara. She sat near the back, her posture relaxed, but her eyes tracking every movement in the room, every door, every vent, every shift in the professor's tone. If she suspected anything, she gave no outward sign of it. Instructor Marsh moved along the back wall, adjusting something on a control panel I had not noticed before, tucked discreetly behind a supply cabinet. My pulse quickened. This was it. Whatever they had planned was about to begin. Professor Draven continued speaking, walking us through a hypothetical scenario, a coolant containment failure, a common enough hazard in laboratory environments across many worlds. She described the warning signs calmly, methodically, the hissing sound, the faint chemical smell, the way temperature sensors would spike before visible symptoms appeared. I felt my hands tighten on the edge of my table. A soft hiss began somewhere near the back corner of the room. At first, only a few students noticed, glancing around curiously, assuming it was simply part of the demonstration Professor Draven had just described. Then a faint, sharp smell drifted through the air, sweet and slightly metallic, wrong in a way that made my stomach clench even though I had never encountered anything like it before. Someone near the front gasped. The lights flickered once, then dimmed to a low amber warning glow, and a synthetic alarm tone began pulsing through hidden speakers, rising in pitch every few seconds. Red warning symbols flashed across the wall monitors, spelling out words I had only ever seen in emergency training manuals. Containment breach. Evacuate immediately. Chaos broke out almost instantly. Several students screamed, scrambling backward from their tables, chairs scraping loudly against the floor. One student near the coolant unit stumbled and fell, curling into himself, his hands pressed over his head. Another simply froze completely, staring blankly at the amber lights, unable to move at all. A cluster of students near the door pushed against each other, panic overriding any sense of order, forgetting every evacuation procedure they had ever been taught the moment real fear took hold of them. I felt my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, my breath coming faster, my mind spinning uselessly between the urge to run and the frozen confusion of not knowing which direction was safe. Every instinct I had told me this was real, even though some quieter part of my mind kept whispering that it could not be, that this was exactly the test I had warned Mara about only minutes earlier. Through the chaos, I forced myself to look toward the back of the room. Mara Voss was already moving. She was not screaming, she was not frozen, she was not fumbling toward the door in blind panic like the rest of us. She moved with a terrifying, deliberate calm, low and controlled, her eyes sweeping the room in quick, precise arcs, assessing everything at once, the hissing sound, the amber lights, the panicking students, the exact position of every exit. She reached the youngest student in our class first, a small, trembling boy named Otto Bram, who had frozen completely near the coolant unit. She grabbed his arm firmly but gently, pulling him away from the source of the hissing sound and positioning him behind an overturned table, out of the direct path of whatever danger the room presented. She did not waste a single motion. Every movement had a clear, obvious purpose. Next, she turned toward the panicking cluster near the door, her voice cutting through the alarm and the screaming, with a clarity that seemed almost impossible given the noise around her. She told them, calmly but firmly, to stop pushing, to move one at a time, to keep their hands away from the door controls because panic pushed fingers onto the wrong buttons more often than danger ever did. Something about the steadiness of her voice broke through the panic. Students who had been shoving blindly toward the exit slowed, glancing toward her, some instinct in them recognizing a competence the rest of us clearly lacked. Order began to return to the room, not because of anything Professor Draven or Instructor Marsh did, but because of the calm, controlled presence of a single student who refused to let fear make her decisions for her. I watched, frozen in place near my table, as Mara moved toward the source of the hissing sound itself. Most students, myself included, had been trained to run from danger, not toward it. But she approached the coolant unit with careful, measured steps, crouching low, examining the vents and seals with quick, focused attention. Within seconds, her posture shifted. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, replaced by something sharper, more focused. Not fear, something closer to suspicion. She reached out and touched the edge of the coolant unit, running her fingers along a seam near its base, then glanced upward toward the ceiling, toward the exact spot where I knew hidden cameras had been mounted only hours earlier. I felt my stomach drop. She straightened slowly, the hissing sound continuing behind her, the amber lights still pulsing, the alarm still blaring, and she said something loud enough for the entire room to hear, her voice cutting cleanly through the remaining noise and confusion. She said this was not a real containment failure. The room went quiet almost instantly, the panic replaced by confused, uncertain silence. Students turned toward her, toward Professor Draven, back toward Mara again, unsure who to believe. Mara continued, her voice steady and precise, explaining that real coolant leaks did not smell the way this one smelled, that the chemical signature was wrong, too clean, too artificial, clearly manufactured, rather than naturally occurring. She said the hissing pattern was too consistent, too rhythmic, nothing like the irregular pressure release of an actual damaged seal. She said, quite simply, that someone in this room had built this scenario on purpose. Every eye turned toward Professor Draven. For the first time since I had known her, Professor Draven looked genuinely caught off guard, her carefully composed expression slipping for just a moment before she managed to smooth it back into something professional and controlled. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak a single word, Mara turned her gaze upward again, directly toward the hidden cameras tucked behind the ceiling vents. She looked directly into one of them, her expression calm, almost disappointed, and she said, quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear, that she had noticed the extra equipment being installed the moment she walked into the room that morning, and that she had wondered how long it would take everyone else to realize this had never really been a safety drill at all. The silence that followed felt heavier than the alarm had ever been. I stood frozen near my table, watching the scene unfold, feeling a strange mixture of admiration and unease settle over me. She had not simply survived the test the faculty had designed for her. She had seen through it almost immediately, calmly protected her classmates in the middle of manufactured chaos, and then calmly exposed the deception in front of everyone, all without raising her voice or losing her composure for even a single moment. Professor Draven finally spoke, her tone careful, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. She began explaining that this had been an authorized observational exercise, approved through proper academic channels, designed purely for research purposes related to threat classification protocols. She said the safety of the students had never actually been at risk, that the coolant unit had been rigged with a harmless simulated compound, and that the entire scenario had been carefully controlled from start to finish. Mara listened to the explanation without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Professor Draven finished speaking, Mara asked a single question, her voice calm but pointed enough that it seemed to hang in the air long after she finished speaking. She asked whether any of the students in this room had been informed, before today, that they were being observed and recorded for a research study. Professor Draven did not answer immediately, and that hesitation told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. A few students began murmuring among themselves, their earlier fear now shifting into something closer to quiet anger. I felt it too, a slow, uncomfortable realization settling over me, that the adults responsible for our safety had deliberately manufactured a moment of genuine fear, without our knowledge or consent, simply to study how one of us would react. Instructor Marsh moved toward the control panel near the supply cabinet, his expression tense, clearly intending to shut down the remaining alarm systems and bring the exercise to a quiet, controlled end. His fingers moved across the panel controls, and the amber lights began to shift back toward their normal soft white glow. Then, without warning, every screen in the room went black. The hidden monitors along the walls, the display panels near the coolant unit, even the small indicator lights on the recording equipment tucked behind the ceiling vents, all of it died at once, plunging the room into a strange, sudden silence, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system. Instructor Marsh froze, his hand still hovering over the control panel, his expression shifting from professional composure into something closer to genuine alarm. Professor Draven turned sharply toward the wall monitors, her earlier calm completely gone now, replaced by a tight, controlled tension that told me, more clearly than anything else that day, that whatever had just happened was not something either of them had planned. I felt a chill move through me as I glanced toward Mara. She did not look surprised at all. She stood quietly near the coolant unit, her expression calm and steady, watching the reaction of the faculty with something that looked almost like patience, as if she had been waiting for exactly this moment to arrive, and now that it had, she was simply curious to see what everyone else would do next. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncertain, the entire class staring at the dead monitors, at the darkened corners where the hidden cameras had been mounted, and back toward the one student who seemed completely unbothered by the sudden, unexplained blackout that had just swallowed every recording device in the room. I did not know it yet, standing there in that quiet, uncertain moment, but I was about to learn something about Earth, and about the girl sitting calmly among us, that would change the way every single person in that room understood the word Deathworld for the rest of their lives. The silence in the lab stretched long enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. No one moved. No one spoke. The amber emergency lights had faded back to normal white, but the wall monitors remained dead, dark rectangles staring down at us like closed eyes. Instructor Marsh tapped at the control panel again, harder this time, his frustration visible in the tight set of his jaw. Nothing responded. He pressed a small comm device on his wrist, speaking quietly into it, requesting an emergency systems check from the technical department. His voice carried the particular strain of someone trying very hard to sound calm, while not feeling calm at all. Professor Draven moved toward the ceiling vent nearest the coolant unit, reaching up to examine the small dark device mounted just inside it. She pressed a few buttons along its side, waiting for some kind of response light to blink back to life. Nothing happened. She tried a second camera near the door, with the same result. A third near the supply cabinet gave nothing either. I watched her expression shift from professional irritation into something closer to genuine confusion, and beneath that confusion, something else, something that looked almost like the beginning of fear. A few students began whispering to each other, glancing nervously between the dead screens and Mara, who still stood calmly near the coolant unit, watching the scene with quiet, unreadable patience. Otto Bram, the young student she had pulled to safety earlier, peeked out from behind the table where he had been crouched, his wide eyes fixed on her as if she had somehow become the only stable thing left in a room that no longer made sense. Finally, Professor Draven turned toward Mara, her voice carefully controlled but unmistakably sharp beneath the surface. She asked, directly and without any pretense of politeness left in her tone, what exactly Mara had done to the recording systems. Mara tilted her head slightly, and for the first time since the alarm had first sounded, something close to genuine surprise crossed her face. She said, calmly and honestly, that she had not done anything at all. Professor Draven did not look convinced. She pressed further, asking how every camera in the room could fail at exactly the same moment, immediately after Mara pointed out that she had noticed the hidden recording equipment. She asked if Mara possessed some kind of device capable of disrupting electronic systems, some hidden technology from her homeworld that she had not disclosed upon enrollment. I saw Mara's expression shift again, this time into something quieter, almost tired, the look of someone who had been asked a version of this same accusatory question many times before, in many different rooms, by many different authority figures, who assumed the worst before waiting for an explanation. She raised her wrist slightly, showing the simple metal band she wore, the kind of device most human students carried, unremarkable in every visible way. She said this was standard personal safety equipment, nothing unusual, nothing advanced by galactic standards. She said devices like this were common on Earth, worn by almost everyone, and she said the reason for that was not complicated at all, if anyone in the room was willing to actually listen. Professor Draven crossed her arms, clearly skeptical, but she did not interrupt. Mara explained, her voice calm and steady despite the tension still hanging thick in the air, that Earth was not a place where infrastructure could always be trusted to simply work. She said storms could knock out power grids for days. She said equipment failures were common, sometimes from natural causes, sometimes from conflict, sometimes simply from age and poor maintenance in regions without resources to keep everything running smoothly. She said that over generations, humans had learned not to rely on the assumption that their tools would always function perfectly when they needed them most. Because of that, she explained, human technology had developed a particular kind of redundancy that most other worlds never needed to build. Personal devices were designed with built-in defensive protocols, simple fail-safes meant to protect the wearer during moments of genuine danger, when trust in the surrounding environment could not be assumed. She said one of those protocols was specifically designed to respond to unauthorized surveillance during a perceived threat. The room went very quiet again. She explained further, her tone patient, almost gentle, as if she understood this idea would sound strange to people who had never needed to think about it before. She said that on Earth, during moments of danger, discovering hidden cameras recording you without your knowledge was not treated as a harmless inconvenience. It was treated as a serious warning sign, because throughout human history, situations where someone was being secretly watched during a moment of vulnerability had very rarely ended well for the person being watched. So her device, sensing both the alarm conditions in the room and the presence of hidden recording equipment she had identified earlier, had automatically triggered a short-range defensive pulse, disabling nearby unauthorized electronic surveillance as a precaution. She said it again, more simply this time, so there could be no misunderstanding. It was not an attack, it was not a weapon, it was simply her device, doing exactly what it had been designed to do, protecting her the way similar devices protected people all across her homeworld, every single day, in situations far more dangerous than a classroom drill. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I listened to her explain this so calmly, so matter-of-factly, as if this level of built-in caution was simply an ordinary part of daily life, rather than something extraordinary. On my homeworld, we did not build our tools to expect betrayal. We did not need to. Listening to Mara describe her world, I began to understand, in a way I never had before, just how different a Deathworld truly was from everywhere else I had ever known. Professor Draven remained silent for a long moment, studying Mara carefully, some of her earlier sharpness fading into something closer to genuine unsettled curiosity. She asked, more quietly this time, how many other students on Earth carried devices with similar protocols built into them. Mara said, almost all of them did, though most people never needed to think about it, because the protocols only activated under very specific conditions. She said it was simply considered basic personal safety where she came from, no different from wearing a seatbelt or checking a smoke detector, an unremarkable precaution most people carried without a second thought. Instructor Marsh finally spoke, his voice quieter now, some of his earlier frustration replaced by something more thoughtful. He asked whether the defensive pulse had caused any permanent damage to the recording equipment. Mara shook her head, explaining that the pulse was designed to be temporary and non-damaging, meant only to interrupt active recording during a perceived threat, not to destroy the equipment entirely. She said the cameras would likely reset and return to normal function once enough time had passed without further triggering conditions present. As if her words had summoned the answer directly, one of the wall monitors flickered back to life, its dark screen brightening into a soft standby glow. A moment later, a second followed, then a third, until slowly, one by one, every camera and monitor in the room returned to normal function, exactly as Mara had predicted. The room remained tense, despite the returning lights, everyone processing what they had just witnessed, what they had just learned. I looked around at my classmates, seeing the same mixture of confusion and quiet unease, reflected on almost every face. We had come into this lab expecting a simple emergency drill. Instead, we had learned something far larger than any lesson Professor Draven had originally planned to teach us. We had learned that an entire species had grown up needing to build caution and self-protection into the very fabric of their daily lives, not because they wanted power over others, but because their world had simply never given them the luxury of assuming safety. We had learned that the calm, steady girl who sat quietly in the back of our classroom carried within her, and within the ordinary tools she wore every single day, a kind of readiness that none of us had ever needed to develop. Professor Draven finally broke the lingering silence, her voice noticeably softer now than it had been at the start of the session. She said the exercise was concluded, and that she would need to file a full report on what had occurred, both regarding the unauthorized recording equipment and regarding the unexpected technical response it had triggered. She did not look at Mara as she said this, but something in her tone suggested she was already reconsidering more than just the details of her research notes. As the class began filing out of the lab, quiet murmurs spreading among small groups of students still processing everything that had happened, I found myself walking beside Mara, unsure exactly what to say after everything I had just witnessed. I finally asked her, quietly, if she had been afraid at any point during the exercise, even for a moment, when the alarms first sounded and the room fell into chaos. She considered the question carefully before answering, the same thoughtful pause I had noticed from her before, as if she always weighed her words rather than simply reacting without thought. She said fear was not really what she had felt. She said what she had felt was closer to a familiar kind of alertness, the same steady readiness she had carried with her every single day of her life, whether she happened to need it or not. She said on her homeworld, "You learned very early that danger did not always announce itself honestly, and that the people who survived long enough to grow old were rarely the strongest or the fastest, but simply the ones who never fully allowed themselves to stop paying attention." I asked her, half joking, trying to lighten the heavy weight still hanging in the air between us, what would have happened if the coolant leak had actually been real instead of manufactured for the test. She stopped walking for a moment, turning to look at me directly, her expression calm, steady, and completely serious. She said that if it had been real, most of us in that room would never have known the difference until it was already far too late to matter, and that the only reason any of us walked out of that lab with a story to tell was because someone in the room had never stopped being ready, not even for a single moment, not even in a place that was supposed to be safe. The corridor around us fell quiet as she said it, the last of our classmates drifting away toward their next classes, leaving just the two of us standing there for a long moment in the fading echo of her words. I did not have a response for that. I simply nodded slowly, understanding, for the very first time, exactly why the Interstellar Registry had chosen such a heavy word to describe her homeworld, and exactly why the calm, quiet girl walking beside me carried herself the way she did, every single day, without ever once allowing herself the comfort of forgetting why. In the weeks that followed, the Academy quietly reviewed its research protocols, and new rules were introduced, requiring full student consent before any observational testing could take place, regardless of academic purpose. Professor Draven never spoke publicly about what had happened that day, though I noticed she treated Mara with a new, careful kind of respect afterward, the respect people reserve for something they had badly underestimated. As for Mara, she never mentioned the incident again, never brought it up in conversation, never seemed to think of it as anything particularly remarkable at all. She simply continued sitting facing the door in every classroom, continued watching corners and shadows out of habit rather than fear, continued carrying herself with that same steady, quiet readiness that no drill, no test, and no hidden camera would ever fully capture. I often thought back to that day, replaying the moment the screens went dark, the moment an entire room full of students and instructors realized, all at once, that the girl they had tried so carefully to study had never actually needed protecting at all. It was the rest of us who had been unprepared. It was the rest of us who had never needed to imagine a world where safety was something you built yourself, moment by moment, day after day, and never fully allowed yourself to set down. Humans were not frightening because they were powerful, or because they possessed some hidden weapon the rest of the galaxy had not yet discovered. They were frightening, I came to understand, because an entire species had grown up needing to stay ready for danger that could arrive at any moment, from any direction, without warning or apology, and somewhere along the way, they had simply forgotten how to stop.